The history of art. The Universal History of Art was compiled by the Institute of Theory and History of Fine Arts of the Academy of Arts of the USSR, with contributions from art historians of other scientific institutions and museums, including the State Hermitage Museum and the Pushkin State Museum of Fine Arts. This comprehensive work presents the history of painting, graphic arts, sculpture, architecture, and applied arts across all eras and cultures, spanning from prehistoric art to the art of the mid-20th century. Volume 1, Art of Antiquity. The Origins of Art. Art, as a distinct sphere of human activity with its own independent objectives, unique qualities, and service by professional artists, became possible only with the division of labor. Engels speaks about this. The creation of arts and sciences was only possible through an intensified division of labor, which was fundamentally based on a major division between the masses engaged in simple physical labor and the few privileged individuals who directed work, engaged in trade, government affairs, and later also in science and art. The simplest, entirely spontaneous form of this division of labor was precisely slavery. However, since artistic activity is a unique form of cognition and creative labor, its origins are far more ancient. People worked and, in the process of their labor, came to understand the surrounding world long before society was divided into classes. Archaeological discoveries over the past century have revealed numerous works of visual creativity by primitive humans, dating back tens of thousands of years. These include cave paintings, figurines made of stone and bone, images and ornamental patterns carved into pieces of deer antlers or stone slabs. Such artifacts have been found in Europe, Asia, and Africa. These works appeared long before a conscious concept of artistic creativity could have emerged. Many of them, depicting primarily animals such as deer, bison, wild horses, and mammoths, are so vivid, expressive, and true to nature that they are not only invaluable historical monuments but also retain their artistic power to this day. The tangible, material nature of visual artworks provides particularly favorable conditions for researchers studying the origins of visual art, especially in comparison with historians exploring the origins of other art forms. While the early stages of epic poetry, music, and dance must be inferred mainly through indirect evidence and by drawing analogies with the creativity of contemporary tribes at early stages of social development, an analogy that is highly relative and must be used with great caution, the early days of painting, sculpture, and graphic arts are plainly visible to us. It does not coincide with the childhood of human society, that is, the earliest stages of its formation. According to modern science, the process of hominization, the transformation of ape-like ancestors into humans, began even before the first glaciation of the Quaternary period. Thus, the age of humanity is estimated to be approximately 1 million years. However, the first traces of primitive art date back only to the Upper, Late, Paleolithic, which began several tens of thousands of years before the Common Era, during what is known as the Aurignacian period. By this time, primitive communal society had already reached a stage of relative maturity. Physically, humans of this era were indistinguishable from modern humans, they had developed language and were skilled in crafting relatively complex tools from stone, bone, and antler. They engaged in collective hunting of large animals using spears and javelins. Clans had begun to unite into tribes, and matriarchy was emerging. More than 900,000 years separated the earliest humans from modern humans before the hand and brain had matured enough for artistic creativity. Meanwhile, the production of primitive stone tools dates back to much earlier times, in the Lower and Middle Paleolithic. The Sinanthropes, whose remains were discovered near Beijing, had already reached a fairly advanced level in crafting stone tools and had mastered the use of fire. Later, Neanderthals refined tool-making further, adapting implements for specialized purposes. Only through this school of craftsmanship, which lasted for many thousands of years, did humans develop the necessary dexterity of the hand, precision of the eye, and ability to generalize what they saw, emphasizing the most essential and characteristic features. These are precisely the qualities that later manifested in the remarkable drawings of the Altamira cave. Had early humans not trained and refined their hands through the arduous task of shaping stone for survival, they would never have learned to draw. Without mastering the creation of utilitarian forms, they could not have progressed to artistic forms. If generation after generation had not concentrated their mental faculties on hunting, the primary source of survival, then the idea of depicting animals would never have arisen. Thus, first, labor is older than art, a notion brilliantly argued by Georgy Plekhanov in his Letters Without an Address. Second, art owes its very emergence to labor. But what, then, led to the transition from producing exclusively practical, necessary tools to creating, alongside them, seemingly useless images? This question has been the subject of the most heated debates and was particularly obscured by bourgeois scholars who, at all costs, sought to apply Immanuel Kant's thesis of purposelessness, disinterestedness, and the intrinsic value of aesthetic experience to primitive art. Writers such as Karl Bucher, Kurt Gross, Wilhelm Hausenstein, and others, argued that early humans engaged in art for art's sake, claiming that the primary and defining stimulus for artistic creativity was an innate human drive to play. Theories of play, in their various forms, were rooted in the aesthetics of Kant and Schiller, who held that the defining feature of aesthetic and artistic experience was precisely the pursuit of free play with appearances, free from any practical purpose, logical reasoning, or moral judgment. Aesthetic creative impulse, wrote Friedrich Schiller, imperceptibly constructs, amidst the terrifying realm of forces and the sacred realm of laws, a third, joyous realm of play and illusion, in which it removes from man the shackles of all relationships and liberates him from everything that is called coercion, whether in the physical or moral sense. Schiller applied this fundamental principle of his aesthetics to the question of the origin of art, long before the discovery of authentic Paleolithic artistic monuments, believing that the joyful realm of play arose at the dawn of human society. Now the ancient German seeks out more brilliant animal pelts, more magnificent antlers, more elegant vessels, while the Caledonian chooses the most beautiful shells for his festivities. Not content with merely adding an aesthetic surplus to what is necessary, the free impulse to play finally breaks entirely with the chains of necessity, and beauty itself becomes the object of human aspiration. He adorns himself. Free enjoyment becomes one of his needs, and the useless soon becomes the finest part of his joy. However, this perspective is contradicted by factual evidence. First and foremost, it is highly improbable that cave dwellers, who spent their days engaged in a relentless struggle for survival, helpless before the forces of nature that seemed alien and incomprehensible to them, and who constantly suffered from food insecurity, could have devoted so much time and energy to free enjoyments. This is especially true given that such enjoyments were highly labor-intensive, creating large relief images carved into stone, such as the sculptural frieze in the rock shelter of Le Roc des Sers, near Angoulême, France, required significant effort. Moreover, numerous pieces of evidence, including ethnographic data, directly indicate that visual representations, along with dance and various forms of dramatic enactments, held an exceptionally important and strictly practical significance. These images were associated with ritual ceremonies intended to ensure the success of the hunt. It is possible that sacrifices were made to them as part of the totemic cult, the veneration of an animal considered the protector of the tribe. Drawings have been preserved depicting staged hunting scenes, figures of people wearing animal masks, and images of animals pierced by arrows and bleeding. Even tattooing and the custom of wearing various ornaments were not motivated by a mere free play of appearances. Instead, they served practical functions, intimidating enemies, protecting the skin from insect bites, or acting as sacred amulets. They could also signify a hunter's achievements. For example, a necklace made of bear teeth could indicate that the wearer had participated in a bear hunt. Additionally, depictions on pieces of deer antler and small plaques should be seen as early forms of pictography, that is, a means of communication. In Letters Without an Address, Plekhanov recounts a traveler's story about finding an image of a fish drawn by natives on the sandy shore of a Brazilian river. The traveler ordered his accompanying indigenous guides to cast their nets, and they caught several fish of the very species depicted in the drawing. Clearly, by making such an image, the native intended to inform his fellow tribesmen that this type of fish was present in that location. It is evident that Paleolithic people used pictorial signs in a similar way. There are numerous eyewitness accounts of hunting dances performed by Australian, African, and other indigenous tribes, as well as rituals involving the symbolic killing of drawn animal images. These dances and rituals combined elements of magical rites with practical exercises, a form of rehearsal and training for the hunt. Several pieces of evidence suggest that Paleolithic depictions served similar purposes. In the Montespan cave in France, located in the northern Pyrenees, numerous clay sculptures of animals, lions, bears, horses, were discovered, all marked with spear wounds. These marks appear to have been made during some form of magical ceremony. The indisputability and abundance of such facts compelled later bourgeois researchers to reconsider the play theory and introduce the magic theory as a supplement. However, the play theory was not abandoned. Most bourgeois scholars continued to assert that although works of art were used as objects of magical action, the impulse for their creation lay in an innate tendency toward play, imitation, and ornamentation. Another variation of this theory posits the biological innateness of the sense of beauty, supposedly inherent not only in humans but also in animals. Whereas Schiller's idealism interpreted free play as a divine property of the human spirit, exclusively human, scientists inclined toward vulgar positivism saw the same property in the animal world and thus linked the origins of art to biological instincts of self-adornment. This assertion was based on certain observations and statements by Darwin regarding sexual selection in animals. Darwin, noting that in some bird species, males attract females through bright plumage, that hummingbirds decorate their nests with colorful and shiny objects, and so on, hypothesized that animals were not devoid of aesthetic emotions. The facts established by Darwin and other naturalists are beyond doubt. However, it is equally indisputable that deriving the emergence of art in human society from these facts is as unjustified as explaining, for example, the reasons behind human travel and geographic discoveries by the same instinct that drives birds to migrate seasonally. Conscious human activity is the opposite of the instinctive, unconscious behavior of animals. Certain color, sound, and other stimuli indeed influence the biological sphere of animals, and through evolution, they become fixed as unconditional reflexes, though in only a few, relatively rare cases do these stimuli coincide with human notions of beauty and harmony. It cannot be denied that colors, lines, as well as sounds and scents, affect the human body, some in an irritating, repulsive manner, others, on the contrary, in a strengthening way, promoting proper and active functioning. This influence is, in one way or another, taken into account in human artistic activity, but it by no means forms its foundation. The motivations that led Paleolithic humans to carve and engrave animal figures on cave walls had nothing in common with instinctive impulses, rather, they represented a conscious and purposeful creative act by a being that had long broken free from the chains of blind instinct and embarked on the path of mastering the forces of nature, and thus, of comprehending them. Marx wrote, "The spider carries out operations resembling those of the weaver, and the bee, in constructing its wax cells, shames certain human architects. But what distinguishes the worst architect from the best bee from the very beginning is that before building a cell from wax, he has already built it in his mind. At the end of the labor process, a result emerges that already existed in the worker's imagination at the beginning of the process, that is, ideally. The worker differs from the bee not only in that he changes the form of what nature provides, in what nature has given, he also realizes his conscious purpose, which serves as a law determining the manner and nature of his actions and to which he must subordinate his will. To be capable of pursuing a conscious goal, a person must understand the natural object they are dealing with and grasp its inherent properties. The ability to acquire knowledge does not emerge immediately, it belongs to those dormant forces that develop in humans through their interaction with nature. As an expression of this capacity, art arises, precisely at the moment when labor itself has moved beyond its first animal-like instinctive forms, and has freed itself from its primitive, instinctive nature. At its origins, art, particularly visual art, was one aspect of labor that had reached a certain level of consciousness. A person draws an animal, in doing so, they synthesize their observations of it, increasingly accurately reproducing its form, habits, movements, and various states. They formulate and record their knowledge through this drawing. At the same time, they learned to generalize. A single depiction of a deer conveys features observed in an entire group of deer. This alone provides a tremendous stimulus to the development of thought. The progressive role of artistic creativity in shaping human consciousness and altering their relationship with nature can hardly be overestimated. Nature is no longer as obscure, no longer as enigmatic, for now, gradually and tentatively, humans begin to study it. Thus, prehistoric visual art is, at the same time, the embryonic stage of science, or more precisely, of primitive knowledge. It is understandable that at this early, primitive stage of societal development, these forms of knowledge could not yet be separated as they would be in later times. Initially, they appeared as an inseparable whole. It was not yet art in the full sense of the word, nor was it knowledge in the strictest sense, but rather something in which the primary elements of both were inextricably intertwined. In this context, it becomes clear why Paleolithic art devotes so much attention to animals and relatively little to humans. Its primary focus is the study of the external natural world. Even at a time when animals were already being depicted with remarkable realism and vitality, human figures were almost always rendered in an extremely primitive and clumsy manner, except for a few rare examples, such as the reliefs from Lhasa. In Paleolithic art, there is not yet the predominant interest in the world of human relationships that characterizes art once it has distinguished its domain from that of science. From the monuments of primitive art, at least, visual art, it is difficult to learn anything about the life of the tribal community beyond its hunting activities and the associated magical rituals. The primary focus remains the object of the hunt, the animal. Its study held the greatest practical significance, as it was the primary source of survival. The utilitarian and cognitive approach to painting and sculpture is evident in the predominant depiction of animals, particularly those species whose hunting was especially crucial, as well as difficult and dangerous, requiring particularly thorough study. Birds and plants were depicted only rarely. Of course, people of the Paleolithic era were not yet capable of correctly understanding either the laws of the natural world around them or the patterns of their own actions. There was still no clear awareness of the distinction between reality and illusion. What was seen in a dream was likely perceived as just as real as what was seen in waking life. Out of this chaotic blend of mythical perceptions, primitive magic emerged, a direct consequence of the extreme underdevelopment, naivety, and contradictions within the consciousness of early humans. They conflated the material with the spiritual, ascribing material existence to immaterial states of mind simply due to ignorance. By drawing the figure of an animal, a person, in a certain sense, truly mastered the animal, since they came to understand it, and knowledge is the key to dominion over nature. The vital necessity of figurative knowledge was the reason for the emergence of art. However, our ancestors took this mastery, in a literal sense, performing magical rituals around their drawings to ensure a successful hunt. They reinterpreted the true, rational motives of their actions through a lens of fantasy. That said, it is quite likely that not all artistic creations served ritualistic purposes. Other motivations were certainly at play, such as the need to exchange knowledge, as previously mentioned. Nonetheless, it is difficult to deny that most paintings and sculptures served magical functions. People began engaging in art long before they developed a concept of art, and long before they could grasp its true significance or practical value. As they acquired the ability to depict the visible world, they remained unaware of the true social importance of this skill. A similar process occurred much later in the development of science, which also gradually freed itself from the grip of naive and fantastical ideas. Medieval alchemists, for instance, sought to discover the philosopher's stone, and devoted years of intense labor to this pursuit. They never found it, but in the process, they gained invaluable experience in studying the properties of metals, acids, and salts, paving the way for the future development of chemistry. When we say that primitive art was one of the earliest forms of knowledge and exploration of the surrounding world, we must not assume that it was therefore devoid of aesthetic qualities in the true sense of the word. The aesthetic is not fundamentally opposed to the useful. The labor processes involved in making tools, which, as we know, began many millennia before humans took up drawing and sculpting, had already to some extent prepared people for aesthetic judgment. These processes taught them the principles of expediency and the correspondence between form and function. The earliest tools were nearly shapeless, mere chunks of stone roughly hewn on one side, and later on both, used for a variety of purposes, digging, cutting, and more. As tools became specialized for particular functions, such as pointed implements, scrapers, chisels, and needles, they acquired more distinct and appropriate shapes, which also made them more refined. This process led to an awareness of symmetry and proportion, fostering a sense of balance, an essential quality in art. Thus, when early humans, seeking to improve the efficiency of their labor, learned to appreciate and recognize the practical importance of well-formed objects, they were also able to depict the complex forms of the living world, creating works of significant and compelling aesthetic value. With bold, precise strokes and sweeping patches of red, yellow, and black pigment, they portrayed the massive, powerful body of the bison. The image was full of life. One could sense the tremor of tense muscles, the springy strength of short, sturdy legs, and the animal's readiness to charge forward, lowering its massive head, brandishing its horns, and glaring with bloodshot eyes from beneath its brow. The artist likely envisioned vividly the bison's heavy gallop through the thicket, its furious roar, and the war cries of the hunters in pursuit. In numerous depictions of deer and does, primitive artists masterfully conveyed the slender elegance of these animals, the nervous grace of their silhouettes, and the alert tension revealed in the tilt of the head, the pricked ears, and the curves of their bodies as they listened for danger. By capturing with remarkable precision both the fearsome power of the bison and the delicate grace of the doe, these early humans inevitably absorbed the very concepts of strength and grace, roughness and refinement, though they may not yet have had the words to define them. And what about a slightly later depiction of a mother elephant shielding her calf with her trunk from an attacking tiger? Does this not suggest that the artist's interest had expanded beyond the mere appearance of animals to their very lives and behaviors? They observed and found meaning in the expressive and touching moments of the animal world, such as the maternal instinct in action. In short, even at this stage of development, artistic activity was already refining and enriching human emotional experience. We cannot deny that Paleolithic art also shows early signs of composition. Admittedly, most cave paintings appear scattered across the walls without clear organization, lacking spatial relationships between figures or any attempt to depict a background or setting, for example, the ceiling paintings of Altamira Cave. However, where images were placed within a natural frame, such as on deer antlers, bone tools, or the so-called chief's wands, they were often skillfully adapted to their surfaces. On wands that are elongated yet wide enough, artists frequently carve processions of horses or deer, one following another. Narrower wands feature fish or even snakes. Sculptural depictions of animals were often placed on the handles of knives or tools, carefully shaped to reflect both the natural posture of the animal and the functional form of the handle. In these cases, we see the earliest elements of what would later become applied art, where artistic expression is inevitably shaped by the practical function of the object. Finally, in the Upper Paleolithic, although rarely, we begin to see multi-figure compositions. These are not always simple, primitive lists of separate figures arranged on a flat surface. Some depictions present a herd of deer or a group of horses as a cohesive whole, conveying a sense of mass by showing a dense forest of antlers receding into the distance or a procession of heads, while only a few animals in the foreground or at the edges are fully drawn. Even more striking are compositions such as deer crossing a river, seen in bone carvings from Lortet or a rock engraving from Lemuel, where the figures of walking deer are spatially integrated, yet each retains its own distinct characteristics. These and similar works reveal a remarkably advanced level of conceptual thinking, shaped through labor and artistic expression. At this stage, people had already begun to grasp the qualitative difference between the singular and the collective, recognizing that a group is not merely a sum of individual units but a unified entity with its own distinct qualities. The development of early ornamental forms, which evolved alongside figurative art, also reflected the ability to generalize, to abstract and identify common properties and patterns across various natural forms. Observing these forms led to the conceptualization of the circle, straight, wavy, and zigzagging lines, and, as previously noted, principles of symmetry, rhythmic repetition, and so on. Ornamentation is by no means a purely arbitrary human invention. Like all forms of art, it is rooted in real-world prototypes. Nature itself provides numerous examples of ornamentation in its purest form, including geometric patterns, the intricate designs on butterfly wings, the feather arrangements of birds, such as a peacock's tail, the scaly skin of a snake, the crystalline structures of snowflakes, and the spirals of seashells. Additionally, the very structure of flower petals, the rippling flow of a stream, and the forms of plants and animals all reveal an inherent ornamental quality, a distinct rhythmic alternation of shapes. Symmetry and rhythm are outward expressions of fundamental natural laws governing balance and interconnection within any organism. As we can see, in creating ornamental art modeled after nature, humans were once again driven by a need for knowledge, a desire to explore and understand the laws of nature, though, of course, they were not consciously aware of this motivation. Even in the Paleolithic era, ornamentation existed in the form of parallel wavy lines, zigzags, and spirals adorning tools and objects. It is possible that these designs were initially perceived as representations of specific objects, or rather, parts of objects, serving as symbolic markers. Regardless of their original meaning, an independent branch of artistic expression, ornamental art, began to take shape in the earliest times. It reached its full development in the Neolithic period, coinciding with the emergence of pottery. Neolithic clay vessels were decorated with a variety of patterns, including concentric circles, triangles, and checkerboard motifs. However, in Neolithic and later Bronze Age art, scholars note a distinct shift, not only in the refinement of ornamental design itself but also in the application of ornamental techniques to depictions of animals and humans. This shift led to the increasing stylization of these figures. When examining prehistoric art in chronological order, albeit in a highly approximate manner, as precise dating is impossible, a clear progression emerges. The earliest depictions of animals from the Aurignacian period remain primitive, drawn with simple linear contours, lacking detail, and often making it difficult to identify the species depicted. These crude images reflect the artist's inexperience and uncertainty, the first, imperfect attempts at representation. Over time, skill improved, and by the Magdalenian period, prehistoric realism had reached its pinnacle, producing what could be considered classical examples of early art. Toward the end of the Paleolithic and into the Neolithic and Bronze Ages, schematic and simplified drawings became more common. This simplification, however, was no longer merely a result of artistic inexperience but rather a deliberate stylistic choice. The growing division of labor within primitive communities and the emergence of clan structures, with their increasingly complex social relationships, contributed to a fundamental shift in how humans perceived the world. The Paleolithic worldview, both powerful and naive, began to fracture. Primitive magic, which had once been closely tied to direct and unfiltered perceptions of reality, gradually evolved into a more elaborate system of mythological beliefs. Eventually, these beliefs gave rise to religious cults, which introduced the idea of a second world, a mysterious, unseen realm distinct from the tangible one. As human knowledge expanded and an increasing number of natural phenomena entered their awareness, so too did the number of mysteries they sought to explain. Yet, these enigmas could no longer be solved through simple analogies with familiar objects. The human mind, driven by the needs of material progress, sought to penetrate these mysteries, but in doing so, it also risked becoming detached from the real world. With the growing complexity of religious cults, a distinct group of priests and sorcerers emerged, wielding art in a way that stripped it of its original realism. While art had always played a role in magical practices, for the Paleolithic hunter, the logic was straightforward: the more lifelike the painted animal, the more effective the magic in achieving the desired outcome. But when an image was no longer seen as a double of a real creature and instead became an idol, a fetish, an embodiment of mysterious and dark forces, realism was no longer necessary. On the contrary, the image gradually transformed into something increasingly distant from reality, an abstract, fantastical version of what existed in everyday life. Across different cultures, religious art tended to be the most deformed, the most detached from realism. This process gave rise to the monstrous and terrifying idols of the Aztecs, the imposing statues of Polynesian cultures, and similar sacred representations. However, it would be a mistake to reduce all clan-era art to this religious line. The tendency toward schematization was not all-encompassing. Alongside it, realism continued to develop, though in a different form. It flourished primarily in artistic domains with little connection to religion, such as applied arts and crafts. The separation of craftsmanship from agriculture laid the groundwork for trade and marked the transition from a clan-based society to a class-based one. This period, often referred to as the era of military democracy, which different cultures experienced at different times, was characterized by a golden age of artistic craftsmanship. At this stage of social development, artistic progress was embodied in decorative arts. However, since applied art was always tied to the practical function of objects, it could never fully explore or develop all the artistic possibilities that had been latent in Paleolithic art. The art of the primitive communal system bore the mark of strength, simplicity, and masculinity. Within its own framework, it was realistic and deeply sincere. The idea of professionalism in art did not exist. Of course, not every member of a tribal community engaged in painting or sculpture, and natural talent may have played a role. However, artistic skill conferred no special privileges. What the artist created was a collective expression, made for and on behalf of the entire community. Yet, this art was still limited in scope, its worldview enclosed, and its integrity rooted in the underdeveloped state of social consciousness. Artistic progress could only continue at the cost of losing this initial unity, a shift that became evident in the later stages of primitive society. Compared to Upper Paleolithic art, these later periods may seem to signal a decline in artistic quality, but this decline was only relative. By simplifying and schematizing images, prehistoric artists learned to generalize, to abstract concepts such as straight and curved lines, circles, and geometric forms. They developed skills in deliberate composition and spatial arrangement, an unconscious but necessary foundation for the structured artistic traditions of ancient slave-owning civilizations. One could say that by the Neolithic period, fundamental principles of rhythm and composition had fully taken shape. In this way, the art of the later clan-based society was both a symptom of its disintegration and a transitional step toward the artistic achievements of the slave-owning era.